So now that we've gone through all the different drawers, we want to focus on the components inside the user interface drawer. Okay, so you see these are all my components right here. You might also hear me refer to them as widgets, just letting you know that that might slip out. I might call it a widget in Python. I run a class with Python GUI apps as well. And sometimes well, that's what they're called. They're called widgets in there. So you might hear me accidentally call it that. I'll probably quickly correct myself. But okay, so that's your palette. These are where all the components are in all the drawers. Each drawer has different components in it. The same way, if you look in a toolbox, you can have different drawers in your toolbox, and you might have nails and screws, nails in one, and screws in another compartment, and then your hammer and wrench and screwdriver and all that. So those are all different drawers inside your palette. Then you have your viewer, and this is where you're actually going to be dragging and dropping these components into. They should show up on the screen. Now this is not eventually, you won't see what your app is going to look like on here. You're going to eventually connect to an emulator or your actual Android device. An emulator is just an online representation of what an app would look like. So rather than actually, let's say you don't have an Android device, you can use an emulator and still see what the app will look like on an Android device. Okay, so you are going to eventually be dragging and dropping these different components into the viewer. And this is just a way to organize things on your screen. Okay. And then we have a list of your components that you have. Right now, we haven't dragged any of the components over here. So there's nothing here, only the Screen1. A screen is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a screen that exists within your app. Sometimes most apps have multiple screens, but you want to limit the number of screens that you have. A good rule of thumb is to have 4 or 5 screens, and we'll talk more about that later. But right now, we have one screen. And in App Inventor, screen 1 will always be your title screen. Okay, so you're not able to rename screen 1, and that's important to know. If you want to add additional screens, you can click here and add screen, but it's important to know that in screen 1, in this little awesome app we're making, we're only going to use one screen, but know that you can't change screen 1, and your app will always open with screen 1 every single time. Okay, so if you want to go back and make a title screen, you can't do that. Screen 1 will always be your title screen. So, and then on the right are all your properties. And these are all the properties of, and eventually as you add components on here, you'll have a list of components. Then you'll have properties of what actually exists. And we'll talk about them in a little bit, but this is the main layout. You have your palette, you have your viewer, your components, and then your properties. Media we'll talk about later. That's if you start uploading pictures and videos and things like that. And that takes up a lot of space, so we'll talk about that later. But this is the basic layout of what you'll be using in App Inventor. Don't be overwhelmed by everything. This is just a designer view. This is how you design the app. The programming side is going to be found in the blocks view, and we'll talk about that later. But right now, all you need to know is that this is what we're working with, and you're eventually going to be dragging these components into the viewer.